There's a temptation when we look at a museum skeleton or a slick documentary reconstruction to assume that science simply knows what these animals looked like, that someone dug up the bones and the answer fell out, obvious and complete. But that's not how it works. Almost every prehistoric animal you can picture is, to some degree, an educated guess. A reconstruction built from incomplete bones, best assumptions, and a fair amount of imagination filling the gaps. And when you're guessing, you get things wrong. Sometimes a little wrong, and sometimes so spectacularly, hilariously wrong that the mistake stands in a museum for 100 years before anyone catches it. Today, I want to walk you through the greatest blunders in the history of paleontology. The animals that scientists got horribly, wonderfully wrong. Because these mistakes aren't an embarrassment, they're the best illustration I know of how science actually works. Not by knowing, but by being wrong a little less over time. Let's start with a genuine classic. The dinosaur that spent decades wearing its thumb on its face. The animal is Iguanodon, and it holds a special place in history as one of the very first dinosaurs ever scientifically described, way back in 1825 by an English country doctor named Gideon Mantell. Now, put yourself in Mantell's shoes. The word dinosaur hadn't even been invented yet. Nobody on Earth had any framework for what these creatures were. He had a scattering of bones and some teeth that resembled a modern iguana's, just enormous, hence the name iguana tooth. And among those bones was a strange, pointed, conical spike. So Mantell did what any reasonable person would do. He looked at the natural world for a comparison, landed on the rhinoceros, and concluded this spike must be a horn that sat on the animal's nose. And so the first reconstructions of Iguanodon show a hulking, four-legged, vaguely reptilian beast with a jaunty little horn on its snout. It even got immortalized that way. There are life-sized Iguanodon statues built in the 1850s, still standing at Crystal Palace in London to this day, nose horn and all. A permanent monument to a mistake. Because it wasn't a nose horn. When far more complete Iguanodon skeletons turned up in a Belgian coal mine in 1878, the truth came out. That spike didn't belong on the nose at all. It belonged on the hand. It was a thumb, a large, rigid, conical thumb spike, one on each forelimb. And here's the lovely part. We still aren't entirely sure what it was for. Defense against predators, maybe. Foraging, cracking seeds. We genuinely don't know. So Iguanodon went from a rhino-nosed monster to a duck-billed plant-eater with a switchblade thumb. A total transformation from a single misplaced bone. Now, misplacing a thumb is one thing. Our next scientist put an animal's head on the wrong end of its body, and it kicked off one of the great feuds in scientific history. The animal is Elasmosaurus, a plesiosaur, one of those marine reptiles with a famously absurdly long neck. And in 1868, the American paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope got his hands on a specimen and set about assembling it. But here was the problem. Nobody had ever seen a neck that long. It simply didn't compute. So when Cope reconstructed the skeleton, he looked at that impossibly long series of vertebrae and made a reasonable-sounding assumption, that it must be the tail. And he stuck the skull on the short end. He built an Elasmosaurus with a stubby neck and a preposterously long tail, with its head on entirely the wrong end of the animal. And it might have quietly slipped by, except for who noticed. His great rival, Othniel Charles Marsh, spotted the error and, by some accounts, took great delight in pointing it out. The two men already despised each other, and this humiliation is often cited as one of the sparks of the infamous Bone Wars, a decades-long, increasingly bitter rivalry in which Cope and Marsh raced to outdiscover, outname, and thoroughly embarrass one another across the American West. They bribed, they sabotaged, they insulted each other in the press, and along the way, they described a staggering number of new dinosaurs. So one backwards plesiosaur helped ignite the most productive feud in the history of the science. And here's the irony. Because Marsh, the man who caught Cope's mistake, was about to make one of the most famous blunders of all time. One so sticky, it's still lodged in the public imagination today. Marsh's mistake has a name you absolutely know. Brontosaurus. Here's what happened. In 1877, Marsh discovered a giant, long-necked sauropod, which he named Apatosaurus. But the skeleton was missing its skull. Now, a missing skull is a common problem. Sauropod heads were tiny and delicate and often detached and washed away after death. But Marsh needed a head for his reconstruction. So he used one from a different sauropod found elsewhere, something more like a Camarasaurus with a boxy, blunt snout. Then, a few years later in 1885, his crews found another similar skeleton, and Marsh, racing as ever to name new creatures before Cope could, described it as a brand new animal, Brontosaurus, the thunder lizard. Except it wasn't new. Brontosaurus was, by most later assessments, the same kind of animal as his own Apatosaurus. He'd essentially discovered the same dinosaur twice and given it two names. And the wrong skull he'd bolted on stayed bolted on. That Apatosaurus skeleton stood in a museum wearing the wrong head for nearly a century. The correct skull, a slender, more horse-like head, wasn't properly restored until around 1979. So for generations, Brontosaurus was taught as a real animal, with the wrong face, and then quietly told it never existed. The name officially folded into Apatosaurus. Kids were heartbroken. But here's the twist ending nobody saw coming. In 2015, a detailed new analysis argued that Brontosaurus was actually distinct enough to be its own genus after all. So Brontosaurus, wrong-headed, misnamed, declared fictional, clawed its way back into legitimacy, a mistake that unmistook itself. Now, all of those are cases of getting the anatomy wrong, but my favourite category of error is when scientists get an animal's entire character wrong, when they don't just build it incorrectly, they slander it. And no animal was ever more slandered than Oviraptor. When the first Oviraptor was discovered in the Gobi Desert in the 1920s, it was found lying directly on top of a nest of eggs. And the scientists drew the obvious, damning conclusion. This dinosaur had been caught red-handed, raiding a nest, stealing another animal's eggs. They assumed the eggs belonged to a nearby herbivore, Protoceratops, and they named the creature to match. Oviraptor literally means egg thief, a name that branded the entire group as villains forever. And it was completely, utterly wrong. Because as more of these fossils came to light, paleontologists realized the horrible injustice they'd committed. Those weren't Protoceratops eggs the Oviraptor was stealing. They were Oviraptor's own eggs. The animal wasn't robbing the nest, it was sitting on it, brooding, protecting its clutch exactly the way a hen protects hers, arms spread over the eggs, right up until the sandstorm or dune collapse that buried it there. The egg thief was a devoted parent that died shielding its babies. And thanks to the rules of scientific naming, it stuck with that libelous name to this day, a permanent slur on one of the most caring dinosaurs we know of. And then there's the mistake that wasn't about one animal, but about all of them at once. The way we imagined dinosaurs moved. For the better part of a century, dinosaurs were reconstructed as slow, lumbering, upright creatures. Think of the old Godzilla pose, a big theropod like T-Rex standing bolt upright, torso vertical, dragging its tail along the ground behind it like a giant, sluggish kangaroo. That's how they appear in old museum mounts, old films, old textbooks. It felt right because these were reptiles, and we imagined them as cold, sluggish, primitive things. And it was wrong in nearly every respect. Starting in the 1960s and 70s, a wave of new thinking, sometimes called the dinosaur renaissance, completely overturned it. We realized from the anatomy, and crucially from fossilized trackways, that dinosaurs did not drag their tails at all. There are almost no tail drag marks alongside dinosaur footprints. Instead, they held their bodies roughly horizontal, the tail sticking straight out behind as a counterbalance to the head and neck, the whole animal balanced over its hips like a giant seesaw. And far from being sluggish, many were active, fast, warm-blooded and bird-like. The tail-dragging Godzilla monster was replaced by something lean, dynamic and alive, an animal far closer to a giant, terrifying bird than to a lizard. Every dinosaur you've ever seen posed in a modern museum reflects that correction. So what do we make of all this? The nose thumb, the backwards plesiosaur, the wrong-headed thunder lizard, the slandered parent, the tail-dragging monster. It's easy to laugh, and honestly we should. Some of it is genuinely funny. But I want to leave you with a slightly different thought. Every one of these mistakes was made by a serious, brilliant person doing their absolute best with the scraps they had. Mantell had a handful of bones and no concept of what a dinosaur even was, and he still figured out it was a giant extinct reptile, which was revolutionary. Cope put the head on the wrong end, but he was grappling with an animal so strange nobody had imagined it could exist. These weren't failures of intelligence, they were the necessary, messy, self-correcting steps of a science feeling its way through the dark. And here's the part worth remembering. The reconstructions we have today, the ones in our museums and documentaries right now, are almost certainly wrong in ways we can't yet see. In 50 years, someone will make a video like this one, gently laughing at what we got horribly wrong. And that's not a flaw in the science, that is the science. The willingness to be corrected is the whole point. So the next time you see a dinosaur and think, that's what it looked like, remember Iguanodon's thumb, and hold that thought just a little more loosely. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep looking up.